Welcome to this Christmas Day episode of Musical Talk. I'm sitting here full of Christmas turkey.
And I'm looking desperately for a goose.
Yes, marvellous. Now, of course, actually, the one concept that this doesn't relate to is turkeys, because we're going to talk about Hairspray, the successful film musical, and the successful film musical South Park. That's because today's episode consists almost entirely of an interview with the wonderful Marc Shaiman.
A very special interview.
Indeed. Most famous for those two musicals, at least in musical theatre circles, also Billy Crystal's Academy Award performances, and a lot of what he calls special material as well. And he's worked a lot with Bette Midler as well. The musical theatre fans will recognise the name. Also worked on Broadcast News, Beaches, When Harry Met Sally. This was more on the film music side. City Slickers, The Addams Family, Sister Act, Sleepless in Seattle, A Few Good Men, The American President, First Wives Club, George of the Jungle, In and Out, Patch Adams, South Park, Bigger, Longer and Uncut, we mentioned already, Team America World Police, and HBO's From the Earth to the Moon.
Now, it has to be said, of course, that in most of those that you've listed, he's not a composer or a lyricist, or he's not a song-writing composer. He's there in incidental music capacity, is that right?
Yes, exactly.
But he also does write songs, as you've also touched upon.
Indeed, and for the musical Hairspray, in fact, he's won a Grammy Award.
Did he give it to his Grammy?
He did, and a Tony Award as well.
Did he know someone called Tony?
I don't know that he does, but I bet he probably has done at some point.
Well, if your name is Tony, listeners, and you really want an award, then write to Marc Shaiman and see if we'll give it to you.
Anyway, this is a hotly anticipated interview, so we'll get on with it in a moment. And we solicited listener questions for it, so and I do get to ask all of those, I think, in the interview, except the one that came from Broadway Gal 1994. And I didn't mean to victimise you, Broadway Gal. It's just that he answers it very early on in the interview. Your question was where you were
conversation.
John Waters before being approached to do Hairspray. You'll find that your question is resolved early on. Only other things probably to note are that we'll mention Sophie Tucker during the interview. Sophie Tucker, thought you might have a bit of background on her.
Oh, I do. Sophie Tucker, famous American singer. Interesting. I'll touch upon her very briefly. She has a reputation now, and indeed she courted it during her time as a performer, as someone who was sexually licentious. Mae West drew a great deal of her character from Sophie Tucker. She was a person who could put a song across and put as much oomph into it. She didn't have bedroom eyes, because most of it was recorded. She had bedroom lips. She described herself as the last of the Red Hot Mamas.
I will never forget it, as she might have said herself. So here is another experience I will never forget, me having a chance to talk to Marc Shaiman. And I began by asking him how the creative team for Hairspray, the original stage show, was assembled.
I think Scott and I actually went, literally the first day it opened. We were living in L.A. at the time, putting on a musical, coincidentally. But it was like another time of our lives when we were trying to write musicals and no one was biting. And because we were huge, we are huge John Waters fans. Literally, like online, the very first day every movie opens. And we're going back to like the, Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble and Desperate Living. Those are the peak, those three. So we, both of us have the exact same sense of humor, it seems, as John Waters. So all these years later, when I was writing film scores, first, just as a footnote, the movie and now theater producer Scott Rudin, he first had the idea to make a musical of Hairspray and brought me and Scott and Paul Rudnick, screenwriter, playwright. We had a lunch and he, said, would you guys like to do this? And we were all like, sure, we'd love it. It sounds great. And then nothing ever came of it. He never pursued it, and his option dropped. Dropped? That's the right word? So 10 years later, Lady Luck, Dame Fortune, smiled once again, and after I worked on the South Park movie, and so I really kind of put myself attached to real musical theater kind of stuff, because for almost 15 years I was doing really only film scores, and although anyone who listens to those scores can hear a theater queen desperately trying to express himself, that had kind of passed me by, and all the years of, if you'll pardon the expression, the British musicals that took over Broadway, it was just a different style. It was big and lumbering and serious and, and not just camp, but just, entertaining. And finding a light way to tell a story instead of the heaviest way to tell a story. Classic musical comedy, or putting the comedy back into the expression musical comedy. It had turned into musical theater instead of musical comedy. And so there, South Park was the thing that really turned things around for me. Not only did I get to do that movie, which in itself was just a peak experience as far as movie work, and on that I got to finally, write lyrics also. So I was really writing music and lyrics on something that people were actually going to see and hear. Although I had been writing theatrical musical comedy style lyrics for things like Billy Crystal's Oscar medleys. Well, I mean, that has an audience of a few billion people or something, but no one knows who writes those things. And but on a movie, finally, your name is attached to it if people are looking. And luckily, people were looking in New York, and Margot Lyon, the producer who had optioned Hairspray, people kept telling her, call Marc Shaiman, he's perfect sensibility. So she called and asked me to write the music and said, I'd love to just out and out ask you to do this and write the music. And who would you like to be the lyricist? And I said, actually, myself and my partner, Scott. And I actually don't want to do it unless it's us. Because in the interim years, Scott and I had not had any opportunity to write, and it wasn't fulfilling for us to be only working on separate things in our lives. And whenever I worked with a lyricist and wasn't writing lyrics, I was always very frustrated because I love writing lyrics. And I, sometimes would find myself going, gee, I have a better turn of a phrase, or I have a funny idea for this lyric, and I'm not allowed to say it because I'm working with someone who is the lyricist. So I took that gamble of losing the gig by saying to her, I don't want to do it unless we're the lyricists. And I told her about, that I had co-written the lyrics on South Park. I mean, because it often says music by Marc Shaiman on a movie, people just, even today, through all these years on Hairspray, I can't tell you how many articles or reviews mention composer Marc Shaiman and lyricist Scott Whitman. They just don't seem to read right in front of their faces. And it's frustrating to me because the lyric writing to me is the most satisfying experience. I love it so much. So anyway, she said, well, then I am going to ask you guys to write something on spec. I mean, as music, I wouldn't ask you, but on lyrics, I need to hear. And she also had a fear of a couple writing as a team, I guess for fear that every time we had a fight, the entire show would fall apart. So Scott and I wrote 4 songs. The first idea Scott came up with was, that Tracy needs to wake up and sing her version of Oh, What a Beautiful Morning. But because it's John Waters, she should sing Good Morning Baltimore, which we just thought was funny because Baltimore, just the sound of the word.
Yeah.
It's so unpoetic.
It's so un-Oklahoma in some way.
So that was the first song, and the other songs we wrote are all still kind of the tent poles that keep Hairspray up. I mean, they're kind of the 4 songs that define the point of view and the humor and everything. And so at that point, we kind of became the engine of the whole experience of getting the show on. And Margot would bring writers and directors to us for us to see if we had simpatico with them. And luckily, we ended up with Mark O'Donnell, who was just brilliant and was able to capture John Waters' voice without literally, I think virtually, there's hardly a line from the original movie in the musical version. There are a few, but very, very few. But Mark so perfectly captured that voice.
I want to ask you about being a collaborator with your partner, because I mean, as you said, Margot had sort of some reservations about it.
Scott and I met as collaborators on cabaret acts when we first met. So that is kind of the foundation of our relationship. So in truth, it's when we are writing, we are at our happiest, most, that is, we are truly as one. The cliche of finishing each other's sentences literally becomes true as you're writing lyrics together.
Is it possible to say, I mean, how much do you write them together and how much do you formulate ideas separately, or could you not say where the
Well, I
line
can
is?
tell you exactly how it usually happens, which is, when I can finally get Scott in the room, and that's where as a couple, the fights are, where I would be happy writing all day long, making music, and just working all day long. Now, I'm often called a workaholic. Scott is the opposite. What would you call that?
A non-workaholic. An idlaholic.
Yeah. So once I get him in the room, then we think of what the song should be about, the theme. And Scott is really good at because he also works as a director, he's really good at like when he said Tracy needs to wake up and say, "Good morning, Baltimore," and we see Baltimore through her eyes. And then he kind of points to the piano, and I go to the piano, and the music just kind of flows right out of me based on what I start singing lyrically. And so then I'll come up with kind of a half version, dummy lyrics. Some of them good. Some key phrases are in there. And, that's what we do first. We'll come up with a lot of phrases. The phrases that the character or characters are apt to say or need to say in some way through lyrics. And with that kind of list in front of me, like 2 or 3 pages of, yellow legal pad scribbling, then I will just kind of sit there and go into the zone and just start writing something. And then once I have a kind of a verse and a chorus of something, then, I'll play that for Scott, and then we start really carving it and really starting back up at the top and seeing what's good from my dummy lyric and what we need to create new. And then that's the longest process. That's the longest part of it, is then really making the lyric from beginning to end.
So that's very organic, isn't it? So effectively you're saying you kind of, because the old cliche question that people always ask musical theatre writers is which comes first, and it sounds like a bit of one comes first, then a bit of another, then a bit of the other.
Yeah. In this case it's truly intertwined.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been some moments where Scott goes out, whether he goes out to meet some friends for dinner or goes to the store, and when he comes home, I've written a song. But even then, it's just like a verse and a chorus. I did write, like, "You Can't Stop the Beat" in one of those moments where we had talked about what the song should be like, prototypes, and the idea of the beat being this life force. And by the time he walked back in the house, I had sped my way through the first verse and chorus of that. And then it was fun to, keep thinking of new verses and new ways to say the same thing as each character sees it.
So in terms of that collaboration process, that was presumably different was it different on South Park, and that was a slightly more lyric process?
It was different. It was similar but different. It was similar in that we both write music and lyrics, but with Trey, he's so busy doing so many things. He's the ultimate Renaissance man. I mean, he writes lyrics, writes music, writes the scripts, does, over 50% of the voices. He drew the original artwork of South Park. He oversees it all. He directs it. So on South Park, he had written some stuff, and in his original script there were lyrics, but none of them rhymed correctly or didn't follow the same amount of syllables. And he didn't write in the old school kind of craft. Especially, I remember now, the opening number, the idea, which is not dissimilar to Good Morning Baltimore, was like this, that kind of Beauty and the Beast. Here I am in my town. I love my town.
Oh, well, I mean, people have often commented on its comparability to Oh, What a Beautiful Morning.
Yeah, yeah. So, and also, what is that, in the little provincial town that starts Beauty and the Beast? I can't remember now. So I could see what his idea was. So I took any lyrical fun idea he had in those lyrics, but literally kind of started from scratch and created a lyric that had a form. And, just every time that verse happens, the syllable that's supposed to be hit is always the same, in the same spot, and just all that kind of stuff. And that was never a battle, is not the right word, but he did not have as much, he just didn't care about that much. If he said something funny while writing lyrics, he and a lot of other people I've worked with over the years are just like, "Oh, Mark, it's who cares?" And I just always say, it's funnier. If it rhymes perfectly, it will be funnier. And if it falls into the right amount of syllables, it's funnier because it doesn't sound forced, and there's just something about it. Not to mention, it's just, that's our craft. Come
Is
on.
it something to do with the fact that the comedy is in the timing?
Exactly, and the fact that it flows right on the music as written, it just makes it, it's just the way it should be. So luckily with Hairspray, I kind of got past that of having to work with people who I had to have that argument with, and it's nice when it's just me and Scott that part of the writing experience doesn't exist for me anymore, because for a long time it really did, unlike those Oscar medleys and on South Park. But South Park, on the other hand, was just a joy. But Trey then basically had written some songs. He put them in my lap. He said, if you want to write another verse and a chorus, he just gave me total free rein, which was really shocking. But once he got that I got his sense of humor, he was totally trusting, which amazed me, because he is such a, you would think he'd be a control freak because he does everything. Knowing how I am, I guess I transposed my own way of living on him. So I was really surprised how open he was. And even the scoring sessions, the orchestral scoring sessions, he wasn't even at, because he was so busy. They were constantly rewriting and redrawing the movie. So that was kind of thrilling to be so trusted.
It's very interesting because obviously you have this strong concentration on the craft of musical theatre writing. Obviously that hasn't come from nowhere, and presumably it wasn't something that was necessarily involved in your film scores. So tell me about your history with musical theatre and how that all got started.
I was born gay, and then,
that's pretty much all we need to know, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Good night, everyone. So, I took piano lessons as a kid. And being a really good piano player, when I was a kid, I was in a certain sense, I was a prodigy, but like a showbiz prodigy. Like, I didn't practice enough to be a classical whiz, but when it came to playing the piano and getting a emotion or a showbiz razzmatazz across, I just had that in me, in my fingers, in my heart, in my brain. That was what I was put on earth to do, and I could do that at a really early age. It was kind of freaky. And so when I finally hooked up in my community with a teenage theater thing that two women put on every summer, I found. They put on musicals every summer with, the teenagers from the town. And I went and auditioned to play piano, and I can still remember distinctly when I went to play the piano at the end of the auditions. And when I turned around, everyone was quiet and staring at me, because I was 12 years old and was playing piano, I guess, like a 50-year-old. So from that point on, and I have to admit, I'm sure that just the feeling of being such a center of attention that moment bore into me. All schoolwork went out the window, and I did nothing but play for shows from that second on. I started then going to the adult community theater. And every night I was somewhere musical directing adults. Even though I was 12 or 13 or 14, I was really learning at that point how comfortable I was with older people, or mostly comfortable without having my age define who I was with. Now that I'm an old fart, it's the opposite, where I hang out with the cast of Hairspray, and they're in their early 20s, and I have to keep reminding myself that I'm not their age, which it comes up a lot, because I bring up any reference that predates 1990, and they don't know what I'm talking about.
Was that always the case, though? You say you like the company of older people. Were you kind of drawn to in a way, the forms of the past that compared to what the rest of your generation was into, or not so
Very much?
Yeah.
And I think that's just a cultural thing that's happening with each new generation. I was in the 70s where actually nostalgia actually became the thing. So when I was still maybe not even a teenager yet, like the cover of Life magazine in America was always about, like Busby Berkeley movies and nostalgia, and No No Nanette was on Broadway, and then Bette Midler, who I became infatuated with and just the hugest fan. Bette Midler's whole persona was taking things from the past and putting a modern spin on them, and celebrating and yet poking fun.
Not least Sophie Tucker, of course.
Yeah, Sophie Tucker, or the Andrews Sisters, or girl group songs from the 60s. I mean, Bet, on her first records, did Chapel of Love and Leader of the Pack, with great theatrical arrangements that Barry Manilow did that kind of made the songs become even more theatrical than their original versions. So she and he taught me so much from those Bette Midler records, really taught me about arranging and honoring yet parodying a style, which has stuck with me my whole life and career now, with, you know, the South Park movie being the ultimate example of that.
Where did you start with writing musicals and musical songs? What was your first thing that you did in that vein?
Well, you know, as like a little kid, I wrote, you know, a theme for my cat, and then I would write songs to get back at my brother for, you know, hitting me. I would write songs about, you know, Ronnie as a turkey. And then I'd write songs for my friends and, you know, do funny things at cast parties. And so by the time I was 16, I was already like writing, and I had a reel-to-reel tape recorder that I could overdub myself, and I was going nuts with harmony and figuring out harmonies, and just it just was everything to me.
So did you have a show written at some point in that process?
Well, I moved to New York when I was 16. I got a diploma you can get from the state, or you take a test and you get your diploma. So the day I turned 16 was the last day I went to school. And a few months later, I was already starting to work in New York from people I had met from theater that I'd been doing. And I'm kind of making a long story short, but I ended up actually starting to get work in New York. And my parents, who had sort of knew that they had no choice in the matter, but, you know, once I got that diploma, they weren't worried anymore about, oh my God, you can't, you know, quit, you can't drop out of high school. So I had my diploma. I started meeting people that started bringing me into New York City, which was only 45 minutes from where I lived in New Jersey. So the idea of going to New York was rather simple. It was just getting on a bus and being there in 50 minutes. So by the time, right before I turned 17, in the last few months of my being 16, I already started living in New York. I was staying at friends. I was meeting their apartment, including Scott. But we were just collaborators at that point, and I was just living on a couch. Then I got a job playing in a piano bar and moved into the city in a little apartment with just had a bed, an upright piano, and 2 cats. It was literally so small that was all I could fit in it. And I started writing with Scott. We were working on some comedy cabaret acts where we would write songs. And then I ended up with Bette Midler. It's too much to even try to condense. But so with Bette Midler was more as an arranger. My what's called special musical material, you know, when you kind of write lyrics, special lyrics, maybe an intro to a song that already exists. That kind of stuff just started happening naturally with Bette. And at the same time in New York, word kind of got out, and I was brought up to Saturday Night Live now and then to help write these kind of things. And so that talent for writing that kind of stuff started getting a chance to be exercised. Meanwhile, everyone else that I was working with, I wanted to write a musical with. And between the time I was 16 and 24, I wrote 4 full musicals. None of them that you've ever heard of, none of them that ever became, you know, much of anything. One almost did. And so by the time I was 24, I started doing a review around New York called Marc Shaiman, the First 50 Years, a joke about the fact that I was still only 24 and yet had all this material. And I would do like the best of these shows within this one evening.
What were the shows? The 4 shows?
One show, the first show I wrote was called Dementos. And it was the guy I wrote it with was brilliant, a lyricist, and it was his concept. And it was all about street people and homeless people. And he was so ahead of his time. Of anyone I've ever met in my life, the term ahead of his time so applies to this guy, Robert I. Because in the years since, every single thing that show was talking about, that we wrote songs about, became in other shows. Rent, I couldn't even walk past the theater playing Rent when that happened, even though it was maybe 15 years after Dementos, because we worked so hard on Dementos and tried so hard to get it on for so many years. And then so Rent, and we would call it Derentos. And there was one year and then Cy Coleman's musical, The Life, about prostitutes and street people, and Rent were on Broadway at the same time. I couldn't even open the New York Times and look at the ads. Because it was so heartbreaking.
Musical theatre is very cruel like that, isn't it? You never can tell which one of the different ideas is going to quite get.
Yeah, it took like 15 years for culture to catch, or maybe our show stunk. But I got to tell you, there were definitely moments in this show that were really, really good. And then Scott and I wrote a musical called Livin' Dolls, where Scott came home one day, and we found this clubhouse. There's no other way to put it, even though it's adults. It was like a kids' clubhouse for demented young adults in the East Village of New York, where people who were too rock and roll for theater or too theatery for rock and roll, we found each other, and we would put on evenings at this club. Whether some evenings were total theatrical, some evenings were just they were concept nights, and we would create them just for the sheer joy and the fun of doing something that night.
Right,
creative.
It's true boho, in fact.
Yeah, so Scott and I, being more musical comedy types than the other people there, our input to this clubhouse started to be putting on shows. We would do bootleg versions of The Sound of Music with Hollywood Lawn, Andy Warhol drag queen, where we changed lyrics to like, when the dog bites, when my pee stings, or cocaine that stays on my nose and fall flashes. But 99% of it was all exactly the right book and the actual music and lyrics, and even in the kind of camp. However, I hate that word camp because people use it always in a derogatory sense. But whatever it was, we would also honor these shows, even in these insane productions. So I mean, by the time we finished Sound of Music, where the same guy played Captain Von Trapp and Mother Abbess, who you will find are never in the same scene. So he managed to play both parts. But when he sang Climb Every Man at the end, people still cried. And then finally we said, let's write our own musical instead of putting on these bootleg versions. And we wrote the show Livin' Dolls about Barbie and Ken. Do you guys have Barbie and Ken over there?
Yeah, sure. Yes, since I think the 60s.
Scott just said I had found this book that had just come out about that was like a fashion book of all of Barbie's outfits. And he said, this is a musical. Let's write a musical about Barbie and Ken. And we ended up writing a musical that was very much also like a beach movie, the Frankie and Annette. And I don't know if you guys know that, but I know I had to explain who Annette Funicello and Mouseketeers were to the cast of Hairspray, because there's a mention in the lyric about that. So we wrote this the story of Barbie and Ken as told by way of a beach movie of the 60s. So it was a real precursor to Livin' Dolls, but it didn't have much of a plot. It was really just the fun aspect of actors dressed up like Barbie and Ken and all the other dolls of the era.
Do you know they've split now, the Barbie and Ken? There's been a thing recently. Apparently Barbie has split from Ken. It was in the news.
Oh, well, once again, talk about ahead of time. The people who created all that, Mattel, the company, when we tried to get the rights, because someone came and saw it and actually loved it and wanted to put it really on, and we thought, oh my God, our big break. And it was put on at this place called the Manhattan Theater Club, which is a very prestigious theater company in New York. But Mattel would not hear of granting the rights. They said, Barbie makes, $1 billion every year. We never want her to ever be in anything but in that doll case, in case, a movie or a play or a TV show could be a flop, and it somehow will make Barbie
tarnish the brand.
Since then, after that heartbreak, because once we couldn't get the rights to Barbie and Ken, the show lost its entire reason to what's that French word?
Raison d'être, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
That thing.
So that was a heartbreak. And in the 20 years since, Mattel saw the light of day, and now there's 1 billion Barbie ice shows and TV shows and concept CDs. I that's heartbreaking, because Livin' Dolls was really cute. But luckily, Hairspray came along.
Do you think yeah. I was going to say, do you think if you'd done that, do you think that would have been ultimately as satisfying as what's happened? If you'd
never
bought
like
the Mattel
Hairspray.
shilling, as it were.
The people who are still alive from that time when we had our clubhouse in the 80s, and I say that that's for real. I mean, because it was the time of AIDS, and almost everyone we knew at that time is not with us any longer. But those who did survive, when they saw Hairspray, they were like, "Oh my God, it's like a Club 57 show, only with a budget." But the truth is, Scott and I were 20 years older, and we actually knew now the lyrics have to be about something. And with Hairspray, we had John Waters' brilliant story and characters. So Living Dolls was just a flight of fancy, but Hairspray actually was a real story and about things and people.
That takes me quite neatly onto some listener questions, because we ask our listeners, we told the listeners you were coming on the show, and we asked them to submit via our forums some questions for you. So do you mind if I ask you a few of those?
No, of course not.
Okay, we have one from somebody who calls themselves Lights, Places, Action.
Wow.
And the question is, I was wondering how in Hairspray you seem to weave a dark and very sinister plot about racism into a fun and happy song. So that kind of relates to what you were saying just now about having a substance in a song. How did that work?
Well, I mean, it was already done for us. John Waters already had created that template of this vivacious character who just sees things very simply, and it's kind of the way we should all be. Like, it doesn't have to be so complicated. Just do the right thing. And he created this character, and he created a movie that was a comedy about racism. But luckily, it was also about many other things. And just his tonality allowed it to have a humor to it. And Scott and I luckily share the exact same sensibility as John Waters, so it just came very naturally to us to be able to write about something that is obviously so serious, but always be able to find the humor. Definitely Scott and I, as many people, maybe John Waters would be included, might often in many people's minds go too far in our ability to laugh at everything. I mean, I co-wrote a song for Team America called Everyone Has AIDS.
Yes.
And it's hysterical. I mean, but as I was writing it, I said out loud in the room, I said, "Oh my God, I have a list on the wall over there of 120 names. I cannot believe I'm writing this song." And then my assistant at the time, Nick, said, "Mark, I bet everyone on that list would be laughing the loudest at this song." Because of course the song was making fun of shows that take situations or themes like that and turn them into show-stopping, roof-raising numbers. We're not making fun of people who died of AIDS. We're making fun of the shows, that came to exist. You're
taking fun maybe of the slight pomposity or the seriousness or the over earnestness.
Exactly. So that's where the humor is. But there's no doubt that I can laugh and make something funny in my own mind about every subject there is. And so sometimes I have to watch myself.
It's quite strong in gay culture as well, isn't it? That sort of...
Yeah. I mean, there's certain gallows humor. And, of course, the AIDS crisis only talk about gallows humor. I mean, literally gallows humor, where you literally had to laugh in the face of death every day of your life. But, luckily, as you just said, with the gay culture, the ability to laugh at everything and anything just seems to come with the package. So I sat at many a bedside hysterically laughing with people who were, days away from passing.
It's interesting that kind of, in a way, gives a background to another question we have from Crimson Crow, who was asking that your songs have a great sense of wit to them, and what would you say is the source of that wit? I mean, we've talked about, in a way, tragedy is maybe part of that, or tragic circumstances. Anything else about that?
Well, I'd first like to say thank you for that comment. I mean, that's a very nice compliment. And, I mean, you can think of all the hypotheses about how and why, but also, to quote Stephen Sondheim in Gypsy, you either got it or you ain't. And there's just a certain style of writing and humor that I was just blessed with as just a gift. As it's a gift, just like being able to write music or orchestrate music. Just having a certain way of thinking of things that always, for me, comes out in lyrics. For me, when I think, it rhymes. I can't explain it, but that's just the way. That's who and what I am.
Do you find that there were people who you were influenced by when you first sort of developed that style?
everyone that you could name. I don't think there was one specific.
I occasionally think of Tom Lehrer with you. That's one person that occasionally springs to mind.
I'm a great admirer of him, and that certainly, especially with the show I did last year with Martin Short, that kind of review was very Tom Lehrer. But, all of it. I mean, Cole Porter, Lorenz Hart, obviously George Gershwin, Irving Berlin. I mean, you name them all. Even Kurt Weill, Bertolt Brecht. I mean, every single person. I mean, there's that burst of creativity of that style that happened, in the 20th century between 1920 and 1960. I mean, it is beyond belief.
That leads into talking about the 60s, of course. MyKill42 from the forums has asked, how much 60s pop did you actually listen to during the creative process on Hairspray? Hairspray is incredibly accurate, albeit with a musical theatre twist from what I hear. Good Morning Baltimore could so easily be a Supremes or Chiffon song with different lyrics. So how much pop did you listen to?
Once again, I thank... Who wrote that?
That's MyKill42.
Well, God bless him. First of all, I grew up in the 60s. So that was part one, grow up in the 60s. So all those records were in my head. I mean, I was born in the last months of 1959. So the early 60s stuff is in there subliminally. But then Bette Midler, those Bette Midler records and her concerts really were a great school of the girl groups. And the fact that those songs were so theatrical. I mean, it's a kind of dichotomy that at the very same time that musical theater became separated from pop music, but the pop music of the 60s was extremely theatrical. Songs like Leader of the Pack about boyfriends that your parents don't like, and then they ride off on a motorcycle to crash, and the poor girl has to go to school the next day. And, it's just crazy theatrical songs like, even the Burt Bacharach songs like, Anyone Who Had a Heart. I mean, what could be more theatrical than the groove of that song and the pleadingness of the lyric. So then those Bette Midler records really kind of turned me on to that. And then I was lucky enough to work on a review in the 80s that was both off-Broadway and then unfortunately on Broadway, called Leader of the Pack. And it was the off-Broadway was just an exciting celebratory review of the songs of Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry. And they were one of three couples who wrote almost every song on the pop radio except for the Beatles from like 1961 to 67. I mean, out of the Brill Building in New York. It was this building where all these writers worked. And it was strange that these three Jewish suburban couples, were writing such great music for both white groups and R&B groups, like Up on the Roof and Under the Boardwalk. And so Ellie and Jeff were celebrated in this review, Leader of the Pack. It went on to have a disastrous Broadway run because they tried to fix what wasn't broken, and they tried to put the plot of their life story really within it, and it was just tackily done. It was directed and choreographed with no love for the material, and it was a total flop. But off-Broadway, it was roof-raisingly brilliant. And by working on that, I had to study all those records. So by the time I finished working on Leader of the Pack, I knew every string line and every baritone sax solo and every groove and what made the Phil Spector sound. And then I got to do the movie Sister Act, where all the work I'd done on Leader of the Pack really helped.
Happy day.
Yeah, well, that was Sister Act 2.
Oh, I do beg
But
pardon.
in the first one, taking like My Guy and turning into My God, and I Will Follow Him. And so it just seems like projects that are centered in the 60s have followed me. And then even after Hairspray, I did the movie Down with Love, which was a recreation of Doris Day, Rock Hudson movies, which took place in the early 60s. And I got to do a whole other kind of 60s than Hairspray, that more kind of fritzy, I don't know what's the word, I'm trying to make up a word, fizzy, movie-style 60s. And now the new show that Scott and I are writing is Catch Me If You Can, which takes place in a whole other time of the 60s and for mid-60s and a whole other palette musically. The 60s is a really rich time musically.
It's interesting. Do you think that all composers, to a certain extent, are always going to be are going to take a lot of their musical references from the era that they were children in? Do you think that's always inevitable?
Yeah, I would certainly imagine it's inevitable. Although, then there are some people who you hear their music or writing and you think, my God, they seem like reincarnations from another time. I mean that in a brilliant way, where it just seems like, my God, that person's an old soul. It doesn't sound at all like, the time they grew up in. So, I think it's six of one, half dozen the other.
I've got one more question from the forums, which is Jack24601, which I think is a Les Mis reference, actually, I've just realised. He says, he or she, but I think he, says, you vary your styles wildly in Hairspray, from the slow gospel 12/8 songs to upbeat, bright, welcome to the 60s songs. Which of those did you find harder to write?
None. I can't tie my shoe. I get lost. I lose everything. There's very little I can do in life, but I can write songs. It comes naturally to me. I understand all styles. I embrace all styles. I have nothing but pity for people who close themselves off to any style of music and decide, I like this style, or I don't like this. It's all God to me. It's all music and lyrics, and it's a joyous thing, even at its most depressing. There's nothing more. I find I get as much joy out of a sad song. There's a song called "Lost in the Stars," Kurt Weill. It's about the most depressing song on the face of the earth, but oh God, do I love it. Anyway, and that's, as we were just saying, the 60s, as it's even coming into more focus with Catch Me If You Can. The 60s was this great time where the parents were still had a lockhold on music, and there was Frank Sinatra still, and Dean Martin. There was the last great days of the Rat Pack style was still on the radio. You still had Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra were on the radio. Peggy Lee. When I was a kid, you could go from the Beatles, and then the next song would be Peggy Lee. Is that all there is? And then the next song would be the Supremes, and then we would have Ed Sullivan every Sunday night. I'm sure there's something comparable in England, where we had this great review variety show every Sunday, and for, what was it, an hour? Was it 90 minutes? I don't know. Maybe it was 2 hours. It was the same thing. You'd have Judy Garland and then the Rolling Stones. So that's very much what Hairspray and now Catch Me If You Can is celebrating, this great palette of music that still existed. And there was only like one radio station in every metropolitan area. Nowadays it's all factioned off to, especially with satellite radio, someone can only listen to the one style they want and never ever hear anything else. But we didn't have that luxury. I don't call it a luxury really at all. We were forced to hear everything.
If you had to prescribe a curriculum for a young composer now, somebody who showed the promise that you showed when you were in your youth, what sort of things would you say that it's important that they should be exposed to?
Well, first of all, I can't believe I've grown up into such an old fart. But with this generation, the lack of interest in what came before is so depressing to me. And I've even noticed it in the last 15 years. It's just gotten worse and worse and worse. And it's ironic because now we live in this generation of like iTunes, where you could go, if you have the 99 cents to be able to spend, you can click on one thing. You can go and read, like on iTunes, people's, what is it called, where celebrities playlists, and go and read what someone you love, what the kind of songs they love. And that will lead to something else, and that will lead to something else. When I was a kid, I sound like Abraham Lincoln, you had to go to a library, and you had to send away or only read about a certain movie or a record that you may never get to actually hear. But that's all, that's gone. Now it's all at your fingertips. So I just implore people to explore everything and not see the past as something boring or not worthy to, because believe me, it was all better back then. Everything was better back then, and there's so much to get from, especially when you're talking about wit or romance,
I'm very interested to get your opinion about where the Broadway musical is going to in the future. What do you see as the kind of the next likely steps?
To me, it looks fantastic what's happening. I mean, the rebirth of musical comedy and the rebirth of entertainment and making an audience feel good. Like I said, sometimes you can make an audience feel good with the most severe, depressing shows. I mean, Blanche Dubois being carted off to, the loony bin at the end of Streetcar Named Desire. It's tragic, but the evening itself and the themes leaves an audience enriched. So that's all I'm saying, is there's so many different ways to tell stories, and it seems like the good thing now about the current generation, and luckily for me, especially with this rebirth of movie musicals, it seems, is when I was growing up, I think it was my generation that started thumbing their nose at the older generation's a certain style that they thought was cheesy, too showbizy, too old fogey. I mean, when I was growing up, Frank Sinatra was like this old fart who I had no interest in listening to Frank Sinatra, really. And it was only when I was around 20 years old that I heard these albums and heard these sublime orchestrations and heard the lyrics to a whole batch of songs I'd never heard, and Frank Sinatra's artistry as a singer and the arrangements, the orchestrations were just brilliant. Now, luckily, all these generations passed, the kids don't even know that something is cheesy or should be thought of as old-fashioned. To them, it's new.
It's been de-ironized.
Yes, so that's phenomenal, the fact that all these movie musicals are now opening, and some of them are really good and getting audiences, and it's amazing. I mean, first of all, to even use my name in the same sentence as Stephen Sondheim is sacrilegious. But the fact that Hairspray and Sweeney Todd are right now both up for awards in the same year. I mean, I'm not trying to compare Hairspray to Sweeney Todd, but I'm just saying just the fact that musicals are so in the forefront of things, it's just amazing, and I'm just so happy that I lived to see it.
What's very interesting is that with South Park, you suddenly were maybe reaching a generation that might have treated the styles of music you're using there as artifacts from the past, but suddenly it became very contemporary because it was allied to this animated show. So do you think that was kind of a factor in all of that?
I think it helped to pat myself on the back, which I love to do. I mean, I'm lucky that also in the work I did on When Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle, but with When Harry Met Sally and Harry Connick Jr., I actively got to be part of a movement that once again broke down a barrier, and all these young couples were going to Harry Connick Jr. and realizing how romantic and the class that the style of music had. And I was very proud to be part of that. And so, yes, with South Park was another breaking down another barrier, because Trey and myself were able to both make fun of the genre, but obviously show our deep affection for it. Because you can't really parody something really well unless you know it from being such a diehard fan.
You've talked about on South Park, part of your job was to kind of get the scansion working on some of the lyrics and to make everything sort of fit in. I mean, can you think of any examples of lyrics that you twisted around a little bit? Or
I can't. I mean, I would have to have that original script yellowed with age that Trey first sent me. And there are still some lyrics in there that don't rhyme, because Trey was just like, Mark, I just don't care. But, I mean, on the other hand, like in the Les Mis song, the parody, La Resistance, I was always very proud. We got an award at the LA Film Critics that year. And I said, I never thought I'd get an award for writing the lyrics, "They may cut your dick in half and serve it to a pig. And though it hurts, you'll laugh and dance a dickless jig." So, I mean, luckily it scans and it rhymes. I mean, it went on from there. I don't remember all the lyrics anymore. But it's just so much fun to write in that style and make it scan and make it rhyme.
It's interesting, actually, because you talk about sort of an affectionate parody, but I mean, I don't know how much affection you have for Les Mis. I mean, is it you talked earlier about the British invasion and it being part of that? How do you feel about those sorts of musicals?
That was the difference between Trey and I. Trey, to him, musicals were Les Mis. He saw Les Mis when he was young enough, and loved Les Mis. So when it came time to parody that, I mean, that was his intent, but it was done with great love. But in truthfulness, I had to, for the first time in my life, go buy the cast album to Les Mis and listen to that number that is the what's the word?
Recapitulation, the end of Act 1 number.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I had to kind of get a real quick lesson in Les Mis. And that's only because I was bitter. Because just when I got to New York and had so much music in me, these musicals took over and seemed to just change the what's the word? The
whole landscape. Yeah.
The landscape. So I was just bitter. I mean, obviously I now know how brilliant a lot of that stuff is. But at the time, I was just bitter. In the same way with the Disney musicals, the movie musicals, I didn't really go to see them because I was just out and out jealous and bitter that when suddenly musicals were sort of creeping back in through these animated movies, and I was like, why aren't I part of that? Feeling sorry for myself. So, I mean, it took a long time, really, up until South Park, where I finally kind of started having this feeling, which culminated with Hairspray, of contentment, where I don't need to be bitter, like a bitter freak anymore, and can actually now rejoice in everyone's, I mean, I always rejoice in anyone's success, but I could actually now go and listen and just know, that's so great that exists now, and I don't have to go home and wonder, when's my time?
And have you seen Rent now?
Yes, it took me a while, because I could sense from what I read, oh my God, it sounds just like Dementos. And I finally went, and of course, it's moving, and the fact that, I had lived through the exact same, and was still living at that time through that, I couldn't help but be, touched by it. But there is a certain style of contemporary music in musical theater that I'm being a complete hypocrite from what I said earlier. I'm less a fan. I'm still a fan. I mean, I still love it. It's all music and lyrics, and it's brilliant. But I'm more a fan of for me in musical theater, especially even now, if you tried to write something, it would first of all have to be written by someone far younger than me. But the one thing that movies and theater have that I love is that class and wit and romance that contemporary culture and music just doesn't care to have, isn't interested in. And God bless them. They are writing what they want to be singing about. But it does not have that touch of magic that I feel is what makes great musicals a great experience, Just for me, that is where my taste, veer towards. But I can still greatly appreciate everything.
I don't know if there's any secrets you can reveal, but it would be fascinating to know what's coming up and what you would either like to work on in the future or what you might be working on soon. You've talked about Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, Catch Me If You Can is finally now really gearing up. We have one more reading at the end of February and the beginning of March, and after that 2-week reading, all plans will start going into, full-time, full steam ahead. With the hopes of being on Broadway next season, just so we can have the pleasure of being trampled by Billy Elliot.
Splendid. So another British invasion. Do you think I think you'll survive this one, maybe?
You know what? It's all cool. It's all it's all good. But so that is what is the main focus of my future. But Scott and I are now going to start actively looking for something else to start to musicalize.
Yeah.
And the movies, I still kind of have a career in movies. I have a movie coming out at the end of the month called The Bucket List that I wrote the score for.
Mm-hmm.
Jack Nicholson, Morgan Freeman movie.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I hope there are other, movie musicals in my future.
Yep.
But the state of show business in Hollywood is such that even with the success of Hairspray and other musicals now, I have received guess how many phone calls or inquiries I have had from the film community about creating any other kind of film musical.
Well, you ought to expect on the basis of Hairspray that it would be in the hundreds.
Zero. Zero. Not one nibble or bite from anyone saying, should we develop this or develop that? Not one. And I'm kind of firmly in the film music business. That was what was great on Hairspray, the movie, that they couldn't shove me aside the way that they did to so many theater writers. I am of the movies and know everything about how to make a movie.
Yeah. It's fair
So
to
I
say
was
you have a
able
track
to really-
record. I think,
Yeah, so I was able to really stamp my feet down and say, I'm not going anywhere, and I'm vital, and, you know, I will be part of the creation of this movie. And I was really lucky that that was the case.
Do you think there's any subject, we talked about everybody has AIDS. Is there any subject that you think musical theatre or that musicals couldn't tackle?
No. You know, I'm always surprised when I constantly read, especially on the message boards, when a new musical, people read that there's going to be a musical of, you know, Spider-Man or just about anything, and it always seems the majority of people go, "What a terrible idea for a musical." And I just always say, you know, it all has to do with how you end up writing it. It could be brilliant, or it could be hideous. I never saw Carrie. I didn't hear the score. I'm friendly with the guys who wrote it. From what I understand, maybe they didn't figure out how to write a great musical of Carrie. Maybe they did, and it was just ahead of its time. The way it was staged or publicized, who knows? But I feel it all has to do with if you are blessed with the muse that allows you to create something. I mean, Hairspray was so blessed. It's like, and it continues to be blessed. I mean, the fact that, and please, I'm glad this comes up, the production on the West End right now is as good as it gets. It's maybe the best production of the show has ever seen. And the cast is phenomenal. And we are so lucky that 6 years after the creation of the first performances of Hairspray, to have this yet another version of it that is so fantastic. I mean, Scott and I did not want to leave London. But after opening night, we had like 4 days that we had planned to stay in London and go see other shows. We just went to see Hairspray every night because it was just so thrilling. And the way that it's been embraced is so fulfilling and wonderful.
On Shaftesbury Avenue. Well, here's hoping that we get lots more coming across to the West End and certainly playing Broadway from you. It's been fantastic of you to give us so much time. Thank you very much indeed, Marc Shaiman.
Thanks for asking.
That's all for this week's episode of Musical Talk. We will be back next week with some details about Panto, and we'll be joined by George Stiles and Anthony Drew.
And Jonathan Cohen.
And Jonathan Cohen.
And Adele Anderson.
And Adele Anderson as well. If you want to contact us, you can write to us over the Christmas period or any other time for that matter on feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk. You can call our US talk line 1206 888 2061 or the UK talk line 0700 593 0764 or check out our forums at www.musicaltalk.co.uk.
This has been an Advent adventure for Musical Talk. Copyright 2007 for the last time.